Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on addressing the development challenges posed by criminal violence in middle-income countries. My name is Rodrigo Serrano. I'm a Principal Citizen Security and Justice Specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank, also known as IDB. And we have put together a very exciting session, which I will have the honor of moderating. But before we start, let me remind everyone that we have translation available in several languages. All the interventions will be in English except one that will be in Spanish. So make sure to put on your headphones if you need them. You can also leave comments and questions in the chat. This session has two distinctive features that I think set them apart from most of other sessions in the Fragility Forum. While most sessions at the forum are on the first two letters of FCV, either on fragility or conflict, this one is on violence, in particular criminal violence, and in particular the violence driven by criminal organizations. And while most sessions are about low-income countries, ours is about middle-income countries. So the invitation that we have in this session is to have a conversation about what makes violence different, in particular in middle-income countries. What does it look like? How does it intersect with issues of fragility and conflict? And what can we do about it? So for that, we have assembled a really impressive number of speakers and lineup of speakers that starts with keynote introductory remarks by IDB's Vice President of Countries, Anabel Gonzales, whom I invite to come to the podium and to address the panel. So, Anabel, please.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, open this session, and welcome this panel of experts to discuss one of the most pressing issues for middle-income countries. Indeed, fragility, conflict, and violence is one of today's major and steadily increasing development challenges in middle-income countries, affecting the lives and livelihoods of millions of people around the globe. It is usually assumed that poor countries are more prone to FCV than middle-income ones. Yet, over the past decade, there have been more deaths from conflict and homicides in middle-income countries than in low-income countries in per capita terms, and political violence targeting women has increased the fastest in upper middle-income countries. Moreover, the Fragile States Index identifies more than 50 middle-income countries in a warning zone, all of which grapple with rooted governance challenges that fuel social tensions and could lead into violence and conflict at any moment. Most importantly, many middle-income countries continues to display relatively stable and robust institutions at the national level, but they have pockets of fragility and violence at the subnational level, concentrated in specific geographical areas. The drivers and manifestations of SCB vary substantially across these pockets, and they may span cities, departments, or even larger regions, triggering negative ripple effects within and beyond national borders. This is the case of several countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, a middle-income region, where the most distinctive and pervasive dimensions of SCB occur at the intersection of fragility and criminal violence at the local level. In those pockets of SCBs, three aspects stand out. First, criminal violence is rife and cost the region at least 3.5% of GDP. Latin American Caribbean represents 9% of the world's population, and yet is home to 1/3 of the world's homicides. Half of those homicides are related to organized crime, perpetrated by criminal groups that flourish where state control is weak, and that in many cases even assume state-like roles. Adding to the death toll the psychological and human capital accumulation effects and the lost income, the resources devoted to combating these groups imply foregoing investments in education, health, resilient infrastructure, and other sources of development, reinforcing negative feedback loops. Second, crime and violence amplify pre-existing inequality, and vulnerable groups tend to be overrepresented among victims. For instance, children and adolescents tend to be compelled to join gangs, while conflict situations heighten vulnerability to trafficking in persons, with most of the victims being women. Indigenous people, Afro-descendants, and other diverse population groups also tend to bear a disproportionate impact from illicit economic activities and crimes committed by organized groups. The Amazonia region is a case in point. And third, crime and violence are increasingly fueling internal and cross-border displacements. A clear example is Ecuador, as the number of people crossing the U.S. border has spiked since the intensification of the violence over 12 months ago. This poses challenges for countries of origin, since most migrants are young and skilled and could be a source of productivity growth and social cohesion, all of which are key to building resilience and transitioning out of FCVs. These elements reinforce each other, hinder private sector development and job creation, and further weaken the capacity of the state. Put together, they also foster the emergence of forms of criminal governance, which affects about 13% of Latin America's population and manifests differently across countries, as our panelists will exemplify. The IDB has been a pioneering multilateral institution working on crime and violence for almost 2 decades and has an ambitious agenda to help countries address these issues through knowledge generation and evidence-based programs in Latin America and the Caribbean. Yet, the IDB group has no unified definition or approach to FCB context. That is, until now. I would like to take this opportunity to announce that the IDB group has just approved its first framework to support populations in situations of fragility, conflict, and criminal violence, which builds on our past experience and that of other development partners and constitutes a significant step forward towards a more coherent and organizational-wide approach to fragility, conflict, and criminal violence. The framework is anchored in the IDB Group's new institutional strategy and aims to guide IDB Group management on engaging in FCB settings to achieve more positive and tangible impacts through financial and non-financial incentives. We will disseminate the document in the incoming weeks, but in the meantime, let me highlight that the framework has 2 distinctive features, tailored to address the characteristics of FCB in middle-income countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. First, it focuses on fragility and crime at the territorial level rather than at the national level. And second, it emphasizes the threatening effects on social, economic, and institutional outcomes of criminal violence and criminal governance. The fact that crime events tend to be concentrated in specific hotspots further reinforces the focus on pockets of FCB of our framework. Now, despite these innovations, we also take a humble approach to the topic and recognize the enormous technical and political challenges of addressing these issues and achieving concrete results. These challenges go all the way from developing a robust methodology to capture pockets of FCB amid data constraints and overcoming the hesitance of governments to have international development agents work on these issues, to designing context-specific solutions to prevent, mitigate, and respond to FCB. We also acknowledge the full commitment by local, national, and international actors is critical, and that further collaboration and coordination among a wide array of stakeholders is essential to achieve progress on the FCB agenda. I thus welcome this space at the World Bank Fragility Forum to discuss ideas, share experiences and lessons learned, and seek for solutions to address crime, violence, and criminal governance in middle-income countries. I also invite you to stay tuned for the publication of IDB's Group New Fragility, Conflict, and Criminal Violence Framework. Without further ado, Rodrigo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anabel, for those excellent remarks. And now let me invite our panelists to join us here at the table. If you come, the four of you. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read all the bios, but just to say that what we've tried is we brought you some of the researchers and people with experience in as public officials and civil society advocates that have the most unique and I think cutting-edge experience on criminal governance and criminal violence. You should see their names soon here. This is. Let's see. Here they are. So I'm going to move here. So picking, as our VP has indicated, the new IDB strategy on FCV is distinct from other multilaterals in that we give a big emphasis to this notion of pockets of fragility, these territories where state governance and state authority is being challenged by criminal organizations who use their control of the territory, their armed control of the territory, to impose rules regarding social behavior, social norms, provision of services, in addition to the extraction of illegal rents. And so while the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, does not have a problem of fragile countries, it does have a big problem with pockets of fragility of fragile territories. And one of the challenges that we have with this agenda is how do we measure these territories? How do we measure and understand the dynamics, the structure of these groups and these territories? And fortunately, over the last decade, a team of researchers from the University of Chicago and EAFIT have really made Medellin in Colombia a laboratory for understanding how is it possible to measure at a very small level the presence of criminal governance, the challenges, the implications of these dynamics. And so I would like to, we have two, that is a big team, but we have two representatives from that team here, Santiago Tobón and Benjamin Lessing. So I'd like to start by asking Santiago to tell us a little bit, what does criminal governance look like in Medellin? And how have you measured it? And why should development organizations like the IDB or the World Bank care about these pockets of fragility?
Thank you, Rodrigo, and thank you very much for the invitation. So as Rodrigo mentioned, we've been working in Medellin for over 10 years now, trying to understand, like, first, the market structure of organized crime, and then how this organized crime manifests in these territories. So Medellin, for those of you who don't know, has a metropolitan area of roughly 4 million people, is relative to other cities in the region relatively rich in terms of having high revenues and also having like a relatively strong state capacity, a well-funded bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. But in addition to that, over the last years, there's been like an evolution of organized crime in the city. And this is structured in different layers. So in the basis, there are roughly 400 street gangs that are typically known as combos. Every combo has between 15 and 50 members, typically all are male. And they are typically in charge of running the retail drug market, extortion, and regulating other illicit activities. Each of these combos is affiliated with one of roughly 20 mafia-like organizations, also sometimes called razones, that regulate the illegal sector in Medellin. So these 20 organizations have a sort of board. You can imagine that as a sort of board of directors of the criminal organization in the city. So there's no one single organization. There's just a coordination, like a sort of federation of these different razones, and every razón has a local combo below. This structure is useful in Medellin for these organizations for two reasons. One is that it helps them collude to coordinate on high prices, for instance, on the retail drug market. So I told you there's 400 street gangs. you should think like maybe there's a lot of competition in the retail drug market, but there's not. They coordinate so prices are high. And they also coordinate to regulate violence between these groups. So now the city is relatively in peace, and in part because these organizations have developed institutions to regulate violence so that they can focus on extracting the highest profits, right? And then, in addition to this, at the very local level, and this is where Rodrigo's point comes, combos, which are these street gangs, compete with authorities in providing some governance services. So in every neighborhood, there's a sort of duopoly in governance services between the local combo there and the authorities. And these local combos, what they do is they provide security, they provide dispute resolution in exchange of a sort of taxation that is often called a vacuna, which literally means like a vaccine. And when they do this, they try to cultivate and foster loyalty of the community so that the community can protect them. And over the last years, we ran two rounds of a citywide survey that's representative at the neighborhood level to try to understand the variation in this competition, in this duopoly. So who is the real authority in every neighborhood in Medellin? And so we designed a survey instrument that asks about between 17 and 19 situations to residents and business owners, for instance, about how frequently they reach out to the authorities or how frequently they reach out to the local gang to solve a dispute with a neighbor or to solve an issue related to security in the streets and so on and so forth. And with these two rounds of the survey, the last one we just ran it last year, finished in December, we create an index of relative governance. So if the index is positive, then the authorities are the real authority there. If the index is negative, then the local gang is the real authority there. And out of that, we've estimated that roughly 1/3, for instance, of the city's neighborhoods, actually the real authority or the dominant authority is the local gang. And this is what might link to Rodrigo's point on these are the pockets of fragility that challenge state building and state capacity in a city like Medellin.
Thank you, Santi. And there are many interesting things in that research that we will need a couple of hours just to get all really that they've been learning in Medellin. But I think one point that I think is very relevant here is that contrary to conventional wisdom, what we see from the case of Medellin is one of the most dynamic cities in Colombia and in the region. It's one where you have strong state capacities, probably the strongest if we were to measure it across cities in the region. Still, we see that in this kind of context, also the flourishing of these pockets of fragility. So, and that is something that we are seeing more and more at the country level also in other countries in the region, like countries like Chile, Uruguay, Costa Rica, that used to be the most advanced in terms of their state capacities, are also struggling with issues of criminal governance, criminal violence. And so what I'd like to ask Ben is, one, what do we know about the prevalence of criminal governance across Latin America? And you've done a study, probably the only one, trying to measure this, which is very difficult, but you've made an attempt on that. What do we know about the relationship between criminal governance and the strength of the state, this notion? And maybe, if you have time, some of the drivers that you see behind the expansion of criminal governance in the region.
Great, thanks, and thanks to the organizers for having me. I'll answer that question in a second, but I wanted to just start with something we talked about this morning. We talk about organized crime, and what are we talking about? It's often, in this criminal governance, often sounds a little strange to people. Well, I just wanted to say my view of this is when we talk about organized crime or criminal organizations, they usually have three sides to them. Or at least the ones in Latin America do. There's a side that's like an illicit firm. It's kind of a business. They're trying to make money. They're trying to sell drugs. They're trying to run contraband or whatever. And that one we all kind of intuitively understand. They're like a firm, but they're illegal. And then there's a side where they're like an armed group. They have people with guns, right? And they have some military capacity. And we usually understand that too. We watch the news from Mexico. We see cartels with tanks and things like that getting into gunfights. There's a third side that's less well understood, which is that these groups govern. They act a little bit like a state. Not really like a state, because there's a state above them that's fighting them. But they provide order. They ban theft and interpersonal violence and rape. They protect people who are not members of their own organization, right? And why they do this and where they do this is just a kind of a brand new research agenda that's just beginning. And so the answer to your question is we don't know a lot, but some colleagues, some students of mine, and we studied some Latin barometer data, which Anabel was kind enough to mention in the intro, right? And what we found was across Latin America, people were asked, is there a gang in your neighborhood? About 56% of people say there's a gang in my neighborhood. Then they were asked, if there's a gang in your neighborhood, what does this gang do? And it was like violence, extortion, or reduce crime and put order in my neighborhood. And about 14% across Latin America of respondents said that in my neighborhood, there's a gang that reduces crime or puts order in my neighborhood, right? So about 14% of people recognize something that we can call criminal governance. And it varies a lot from country to country. Brazil was the highest with 26%. Right below Brazil was Costa Rica at 13%, which seems kind of crazy until that you looked at right in the third place was Ecuador at 11%, which was very surprising 2 years ago and is not really surprising anymore. So this can be possibly a canary in the coal mine. There was also a strong, I should say this hides a lot of variation, right? This is a binary measure of criminal governance. Some neighborhoods, we're just talking about a gang that says you don't go to the police, you know? It's not a very powerful gang. In other places, we're talking about elaborate jury trials, right? Like in Sao Paulo under the PCC. Or armed territorial control, like in Rio, with roadblocks and you know, men with assault rifles, you know, deciding who can come in and out, but also providing significant welfare for the poorest residents, providing food and cesta básicas and things like that. There was also a strong, the data revealed something quite surprising, although consistent with what we found in Medellin, which was that systematically across Latin America, places where people experience the presence of criminal organizations tend to have weaker state presence, no big surprise there, less trust in government, but places where people experience criminal governance had a stronger state presence, right? The subset of places with criminal gangs where those gangs are governing are places where the state seems to be stronger. It's a bit of a puzzle, it's a bit of a conundrum, but if you ask me, it's consistent with theories that we found in Medellin and also in my work in Brazil. It's like, why are these gangs governing in the first place? They're governing to keep the police out. So if the police are totally absent in the first place, the gangs don't have a lot of reason to govern. And that's why this is fundamentally a problem of middle income, middle capacity states. This is why you don't see extensive criminal governance in places where there's total state absence, in my view. Last thing I'll say, there's another fragile space, not just informal neighborhoods, but prisons. The prisons of Latin America are fragile in that sense. They are not controlled by the state. The state only controls the perimeter. And I think we're more and more aware of the problems that that brings.
Great, man. Thank you. And I think you got a sense of the challenge that we're dealing with, the importance of understanding this problem, measuring it, understanding its dynamic. That's why, as part of our new strategy at the IDB, one of the pillars of that strategy is understanding better the problem, really to design and support governments to design solutions that are customized to the problem. I like, there's something, one of the findings from the work that Santiago and the team did in Medellin through that survey, just to give a sense of how little we know about this problem, is regarding extortion, which is one of the critical types of crimes that are, we see across cities growing and growing. And if you go to the police, they'll have reported 850 cases, correct me if I'm wrong, Santi, 850 cases of extortion. Through their survey, they found out that 150,000 households had suffered or were paying extortion in the city. So it's like a 200 more. So really, we need to measure this problem better, understand its causes and its drivers in greater depth, and that's one of the focuses of our work. Now I'd like to shift a little bit to what can we do about it, and what have we learned from the experiences of dealing with criminal governance and criminal violence in the region. And probably the sort of the postcard for criminal governance, I think, as Ben said, it has always been Rio de Janeiro, right? Rio de Janeiro, southern parts of Rio, Ipanema, where Copacabana, you saw those beautiful beach, and right next to it, these favelas, these shanty towns with young guys with guns, with assault rifles, and so on. And but it's also been a city where one of the most ambitious experiments of dealing with criminal governance took place. And Joanna has been involved both as a public official in the Secretariat of Public Safety, and also as a researcher, following very closely that case. So I'd like to ask Joanna if she can tell us what was that about briefly, and lessons that you can draw from that experience.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the organizers to invite me. So the pacification policy started at the end of 2008 in Rio de Janeiro. Is for sure, it's one of the most ambitious and police interventions that has happened worldwide to crack down gangs. So basically, like, it reached, for you to have an idea how big in Brazil, for sure, it was the largest, and mainly in Latin America. But in its peak, it reached like 180 favelas, like 800,000 people directly. And pretty much what they did is that before the pacifying police units, like what the police did is that they did police raids when they go into the favelas, stay for a little, and then went out, and then the gangs ruled the areas most of the time. So in the pacification, they decided they're gonna get into and stay. Stay how? With like nearly recruits from the police, with a very high level of police per capita, and they stayed there. So they have, like, in the beginning they need to do, like, when you see the description of the policies, like, they say there is 3 stages that they announce, then they go in with a very military capacity, then they put these newly recruits. But for me, the key thing about the pacification is that it was the first time that we have a policy in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, with the right goal. I think one of the key things we should do in Latin America as a whole, and maybe it's really reframe the problem. We are doing that as a war on drugs most of the time, as if the key problem we have is drug war. And pacification was the first time that they said, our goal is to regain the control of the monopoly of power from the territories and to reduce lethal violence. So by doing that, it was completely changed the discussion. And as Ben was saying in the morning, like, half of the pacification was really like a communication issue, like really trying to explain to the society that it was a different goal. Because war on drugs is something that we cannot succeed about doing. Like, we will never end drug trade, but we should seek and should be worried about regaining the control of the monopoly of power. So UPP is also unique in the sense that it was probably the only crackdown on gangs that reduced violence in the same. So we have an impact assessment of UPP. Based on there was a staggering implementation of the policy, so we can do an event study to see the effects. So the major impact of UPP was to reduce police killings. It reduced by 70%. Like, Rio de Janeiro has a major problem with police killings. In its peak 2019, the police killed officially 1,800 people in the state, in a state with 18 million people. So, but the UPP also reduced violent crime inside favelas, around the neighborhoods, and this effect lasts for 4 or 5 years. So it was nowadays, but there were 2 key problems. Like, it was not sustainable. So it started in 2019. So by 2013. The effects started to appear, and nowadays most of the units are not there anymore. The government was not able to sustain that, and part of that it's because it relies mostly on police presence. Like, and military police presence. You're never gonna end drug dealing just with police presence. And the second problem is that it did create a spillover effect. So we can measure an increase in areas not affected. So areas, police precincts with high favelas coverage, which would be the most exposure to reallocation about gangs, did so also increase in violent crime. And this is, for instance, if you talk to policemen in Rio right now, they say UPP was a disaster because the only thing it did was to really relocate the crime, spread the crime to all over the state. But in my point of view, and I finish that, we should look at that as the first experiment that did create, that really reframed the problem and was able to succeed for 5 years. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joanna. And Joanna said, while UPV was a massive, super ambitious effort, we have across the region many, maybe more modest, more smaller scale initiatives that have been very successful also in dealing with crime, and that we at the IDB have as part of the type of advice that we give governments in our work, and that illustrate important principles about an overall citizen security policy and crime reduction and violence reduction policy. And one of those principles, which is very well established in the literature, is that a few criminal organizations drive most of the violence, and a few individuals within those organizations drive most of the violence. And so by targeting high violence organizations and within them high violence individuals, there is a possibility of achieving significant results. And we have seen this in many different types of contexts that I can elaborate later, but what I want actually is to give the floor to Carlos, because he's the executive director of an NGO, the Association for a More Just Society in Honduras, which has precisely done one of the most interesting, I think, initiatives to put this principle in practice and getting good results. So Carlos is going to speak in Spanish, so if anybody needs interpretation, please put on your headphones. There are more headphones that should be over there. Carlos.
Gracias.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Honduras reached the point of being the most violent country in the world, of 87.7 murders per 100,000, as the people spoke before said. This violence was spread across a number of communities. There were some communities in which, that is some of the largest communities in the country, San Pedro Sula, which was the most violent city in the world and the capital of the republic, Nueva Suyapa, and other communities in which the largest number of homicides happened. Now, we always saw in the press how the despair that people felt as they tried to find solution to this problem, and so our organization, in response to that, decided, and rather more as a reaction in an empirical way, we tried to help and support the citizens. And so first we did a cursory analysis of the situation, and we realized that in all of the different communities, people were fully aware of who the perpetrators were. They were mapped out. Everyone knew where they lived. The communities had their own investigation system, but given a distrust in the police, a general lack of trust in institutions, then murders continued daily. There was one community in which there were 150 homicides in one community alone, but also rapes and other types of crimes. So then what we did is that we identified these people. We hired some investigators, some of whom were former police officers. We struck up an agreement with the police, and we tried to document all of the cases, zero in on them, and to provide the police, which was very weak. It didn't have logistical capacity, the wherewithal to decide how to intervene and to take these violent actors out of the community. And so the project, we kept it up for a number of years. Ultimately, it was adopted by the National Police and the authorities of those cities where it acted, and we brought down the murder rate by 90%. That has been kept up over the years. We created what is called a network of trust, and we brought on board the community so they themselves would monitor the behavior of local authorities so that we could make sure that this action was kept up over time so that we would not ever find ourselves once again in that prior situation of violence. So as you'll agree and understand, this was a project that was possible because we essentially did not have any institutions, a police force that had been captured and was very weak. And to make this sustainable over time, more work, more structured work had to be undertaken. And that is what led us to get involved in a more encompassing project to get the state to take the helm, not just over the country, the territory of the country, but also the governance of the largest cities of the country that, as I said, were the ones with the highest crime or violent crime rates.
On these larger initiatives that we were very lucky and fortunate to accompany through several loans to strengthen the police and reform the police of Honduras. So in the next question, I'll ask you about that. But now I wanted to ask Santi about there are two drivers of criminal governance, criminal violence that often come up. And one has to, Ben mentioned it, these places where there is a vacuum of the state, where there is a very weak, absent state. People say that it's more probable for criminal organizations to step in and take advantage of the lower risk environments to conduct their criminal activities. And the other one is the challenge of the appeal that the criminal life has to all the sort of disenfranchised male youth that are in these communities and that don't have many prospects and opportunities and that see in a criminal career an opportunity, an exciting and a very adaptive response to their context. And you and your colleagues have been testing solutions to both of these challenges, both to the challenge of the weak or absent state and how to strengthen it, and also to this issue of how to make crime less attractive, how to prevent the recruitment of young kids into criminal life. Maybe it's too much to ask you to talk about both, but feel free. Whatever you can share, people then can go and there's stuff written but I think those two are super interesting and maybe mention briefly what you've done in both.
Yeah, thank you, Rodrigo. So I have to run quickly with this. So one thing that we've been trying to understand better in the context of Medellin is gang recruitment. And the reason why we've been trying to focus on this is because there's this idea that kids are forcibly recruited. And this happens in context of conflict. This has happened in Colombia, for instance, with the FARC guerrillas or the paramilitaries and so on. But in practice, what happens estimate, for instance, the returns to education. So with them, we've been trying to run like survey experiments first to see what kind of information changes interest in the gangs. So for instance, we're running an experiment within the survey of providing information on returns to education. And we see that if we provide information on returns to education, the number of clones they put in the gang decreases. We've been also showing the kids in an experimental setting in the survey a video of 3 real testimonies of gang members just telling them how badly it was, like all these non-pecuniary benefits of access to women and so on and so forth, saying how frustrated they are. And we also see that when we show these videos, a 5-minute video, interest in the gang by these kids also decreases. We're now in a phase where we've been setting up a field experiment with like goal setting, planning behavioral techniques, with higher education orientation to see how this works. We've been piloting this for the last roughly 6 months, and we expect with the city to go at scale with roughly 800 kids, perhaps in the first part of this year. So I think there's many questions about trying to understand being in a gang as a career choice, as an occupational choice, and thinking through those lenses, trying to understand how to prevent this. I think I tried to cover some, but not all. Thanks, Rodrigo.
No, I think of the 2 you picked one of the most exciting ones and promising ones that we are also helping and partnering with the AFIT and Chicago to extend to other cities, because we, as I said, the learning agenda, it's at the core of our work. And I'd like to ask Ben, there is a term that he and his colleagues coined that I think is very powerful and important to be aware of. So we're bringing it also to the conversation, which is the phrase, the terrible trade-off. So I wanted to ask Ben if between violence reduction and strengthening criminal organizations, there is a potential terrible trade-off there. And so I wanted to ask Ben if he can tell us what this is about and how to approach it.
Sure, happy to. So I think when I think about policy interventions or what can we do, I'm a bit of a pessimist. Because I think, but it's not so much pessimism. I just think we often misdiagnose the problem. We look at organized crime and criminal violence in Latin America, and in my view, the problem is there's no silver bullet because we've been digging ourselves deeper for decades. We've been using policies, especially harsh, repressive, mano dura policies that have made the problem worse. So the good news isn't that we have a magic policy to fix everything. The good news is that we've started to recognize what we're doing, and we're stopping to dig ourselves deeper, and we're starting to come up with smarter policies that at least don't make the problem worse, right? We're beginning to recognize that drug repression, the war on drugs, increases the profitability of drugs and leads to inter-cartel fighting and corruption. We've begun to realize that mass incarceration, although lots of countries are embracing it, we realize that it's strengthening gangs. It's giving them a base of operations and allowing them to spread. And we realize that violent and unaccountable policing is allowing gangs to do criminal governance and win over marginalized populations and protect them from violent, unaccountable police. So we're starting to recognize these counterproductive forms of repression. And on the flip side, we're beginning to realize that the state can use its repressive apparatus not to try to destroy every single criminal organization, which it's never going to be able to do, but to coerce them into behaving themselves, to coerce them into not being as destructive and not being as violent. That is the terrible trade-off. If you decide to use the coercive power of the state to induce gangs to be more peaceful, you may also strengthen those incumbent gangs, right? If you only use the force of the state as a hammer to smash gangs, you might break up some gangs, but then new gangs will form, and they will fight amongst themselves to see who will be supreme, right? Mexico was the perfect example of this. Mexico in 2006, right? You smash the big cartel, you get a lot of little cartels in a very violent war. So to decide, hey, let's try a different approach, let's use our force to keep these cartels from fighting each other, that's the terrible trade-off. You can reduce violence, but you may have to deal with some incumbent criminal organizations that are quite powerful. That's not something for me or anyone else up here to say what's the right choice, but it is something for society, for governments, and for international organizations like the IDB to start talking about. Second point, there's an even deeper problem that criminal governance brings to bear that I have to mention, which is that as these organizations begin to do more governing of civilians, that is driven by processes of unequal development, urbanization, and informal settlements and favelas and slums throughout Latin America. But it's also now to the point where it is reinforcing that. Gangs and criminal organizations govern millions of people in the peripheries of Latin America. They make those peripheries sustainable. States no longer need to provide basic order for millions of their own citizens. Who makes sure those citizens aren't being robbed or suffering sexual violence or have just enough basic order where they can leave their home and come back at the end of a workday and their home hasn't been robbed? The state isn't providing that. Criminal organizations are providing that. And for many, many governments throughout Latin America, that's fine, right? That's fine. But in the long run, this is reinforcing a kind of unequal development where countries urbanize and they experience economic growth, but that growth is shunted towards the wealthy neighborhoods while neglected informal settlements continue to grow. That is becoming sustainable in part thanks to criminal organizations. So if we don't stop moving in that direction, that is just going to get more and more and more entrenched over time. And that, I think, is a second kind of terrible trade-off that we face.
Thank you, Ben. I don't know if you can mention something about sort of focused deterrence or conditional repression.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. So that's right.
As a way to deal with this.
How could I forget? I mean, conditional repression is my favorite expression in life. So when we talk about the first kind of terrible trade-off, right? Are we going to allow criminal organization, are we going to try to crush them, or are we going to try to use the force of the state coercively to induce them into behaving in whatever way we want them to behave, usually less violently? That is called conditional repression, right? I'm the state. I'm going to punish you, drug cartel, if you're violent. For this to work, I have to also say, maybe I don't say it out loud, but I have to say, and I won't punish you as much if you're not violent. I have to tell that criminal organization, hey, if you're just dealing drugs, but you're not being violent, or you're not employing kids, right? You're not employing any kids, or you're not doing whatever thing I don't want you to do, I'm going to give you a break. But if you do the thing I'm prohibiting, then I'm going to come down with full force. That is called conditional repression, or sometimes called focused deterrence. And it's a proven technique. I think the UPP project proved how effective it can be in reducing violence. Did it get rid of Rio's drug organizations? Not at all. Did it possibly even strengthen some of them, or at least give them the incumbency advantage? Yes. But did it reduce violence? Dramatically. So conditional repression is sort of one choice you can make in that terrible trade-off. If it's a choice of harm reduction, of reducing violence and other very negative outcomes at the cost of going easy on criminal organizations that play by the rules that the state has laid down.
Thank you, Ben. And focused deterrence, it's a type of practice that is inspired or started in Boston in the 1990s with a program called Ceasefire that was very effective in dealing with youth, gun and gang violence, and then it was adapted and has been adapted because it's a set of principles, as Ben was saying, that we, by the way, a public service announcement, we at the IDB have launched last year an evidence-based platform on citizen security and justice in Spanish and Portuguese that basically has curated what we know that works and that has been evaluated rigorously through impact evaluations. So you can find more information about focused deterrence and violence interrupters and other types of programs that have been effective and have been adapted to Latin America in various ways to deal with this problem. And I wanted to pick on an issue that Carlos started, which is the importance of strengthening and working with police and prosecutors' offices in terms of criminal investigation. And again, you'll see there is a good track record of evidence of task forces focused on homicides. There's a very good paper from Colombia called CSI in the Tropics. You'll find it in our platform. That has proven how effective these task forces on homicides can be in terms of reducing homicide. So I wanted to ask Joanna, who also has a past in the prosecutor's office in Rio de Janeiro, about what's her advice, what are the core competencies that you think should be strengthened both in the police and in prosecutor's office, in the justice system in general? What would you select as key priorities to focus on?
I think one of the key messages we should spread out in Latin America for sure is that the fight against organized crime and criminal groups is mostly an investigation effort, not a militarized effort. And I think maybe Colombia is the only country that has overcome this discussion, but all of the others are trapped in that discussion. And I think there is a trap because there is a clear political trap in my opinion, to the point that it's not that all the governments are not doing anything against organized crime. It's mostly what Ben just said, that they are doing a lot of stuff and they are required to do a lot of stuff. So governments in Latin America, they must signal they are doing something. And the easiest way to do that is to use militarized force, because people can see that, voters can see, and voters understand that someone is doing something. But the problem is that in many times, as Ben was saying, this is strengthens the organized group. So I think we are very behind in the political discussion to explain to the citizens that the fight against organized crime is mostly a thing that requires targeting. We need to focus, as Carlos was mentioned, that the people and the groups that promote the biggest share of violence and biggest harm, and that once you identify them and you target them, it's an effort mostly of investigation, and we're going to need to use conditional repression on that. So what is conditional repression? Really to target first the ones that promote more violence, and this would be the first target. But the problem is that if you only do that, we may end up strengthening the groups that do not use violence, but they understand that, then they create very important and multi-product firms. So we really need to deal with that. But my point is, but the crucial thing about really thinking about how to target, to do better investigation, to do conditional repression, is that really we need something that we don't talk much, is that we need a very important information system in order to be able to identify who are these people, to target them, to help investigation. And this is something we are not investing money at all. So in the morning, we have the problem of drugs, of illicit drug trades. In many countries, what we are finding is our multi-product enterprises, and that once you have the means to control territories in several parts of the states, you're going to get involved in all the business and service provision that depends on local, that has a local basis. And this is what we are seeing in Mexico, we are seeing in Rio, all over the place. So once you do that, we need to start to discuss, so what is the key problem? And my take is that the core of of this thing is to be able to use military capacity, or use coercion or whatever, in order really to control territory, to antagonize with law enforcement agencies about who controls the monopoly of power and who controls the area. So I think if we frame the problem that way, we're going to start to discuss a little bit about what the quality of the police, how to control police, how to control law enforcement agencies, that we need to control how they use force. So in Brazil, we have a discussion that it's very hard to convince people that corruption and use of violence by police forces walks hand in hand. People do not believe in that. People are the society as a whole are very accept that the police use a lot of violence. But this is, it's what we open the door for a lot of corruption. We open the door for the police to have a lot of negotiations in the front line, in the streets. So I think, again, in order to wrap up, I think it's a lot, we need to, Ben says a lot about that, we need to reframe the problem about what is the key issue we have, or criminal groups in Latin America, and really like convince people that we need to, the core of the policies to do that relies mostly on investigation and intelligence rather than use of force. Of course, once in a while we need to use of force, but this is not the main strategy. This is a side strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. And I wanted to move to this topic that was mentioned, and it's sort of big elephant in the room, which is the issue of corruption. And Carlos mentioned it, corruption within the police, and it's very much a part of the challenge of dealing with criminal organizations. And but Honduras also again provides a nice example of how to deal with a very corrupt police force service. We at the IDB had been supporting that police reform process for over 10 years, so we think there are a lot of lessons to learn from that experience. Carlos, if you can tell us a little bit about it.
Bueno, llegar a tener 86
To reach 86 homicides per 100,000 made Honduras put the focus of much research to understand the reason. At least 3 different studies or diagnoses concluded what we knew all along within the country. There was widespread corruption in the police, and a number of recommendations were made. One was to shut down the police and to start over anew. To not have any police would be a problem, obviously. 2, this led to a number of sectors almost naturally to start carrying out preventive efforts. And before intervening in the problem per se, we just started talking about it. Our organization, for example, started carrying out our research, and we learned about criminal structures at the highest level of our institutions, or the police institutions. Now, working together with different media outlets, some of which were international outlets, we published this information, and that led the government to make the decision of intervening. And that's what we call the cleaning up of the police. So we engaged in this process, sadly, and it's embarrassing to say, but the state was not capable of cleaning up its own police forces, and it resorted to the academic sector and civil society organizations. And I don't know what they're thinking, what we were thinking at that point in time, but we decided to jump in this cleaning up of the police process. 6,000 police officers of the 12,000, half were cut. Just think about that. Now, it was clear to us that we also had to transform the police, and that's where the Inter-American, or the IDB, helped us to train the police. Police officers would come in with only 3 years of school. And so then after that, we made sure that all of the young recruits would have at least their high school or secondary education complete with a human rights focus, and to bring up the pay for the police. The police academies were spruced up, and where the police work, that is to enhance their investigative capacity, because no one really did any investigations back then. At the same time, we were purging the police, cleaning it up from top to bottom. And so working at the highest levels, 32 different police authorities at the highest level, that from 32 to 28, and we brought down that number. A number of those people who were taken out were extradited to the United States. There's a trial happening right now in one of those cases in the U.S., and that gives you an idea of how corrupt the police was.
We realized that there was a need here. You couldn't transform the police if you had basically a culture of corruption, penetration of drug trafficking, and so it became necessary to do the same thing at these higher levels that we had done at the neighborhood level. Take the criminals out and create a new culture. It has been a long and arduous process, but I believe that the indicators in Honduras today, even though there's certainly remaining challenges, it show that it was possible. It was possible to make those changes. Now, you do need a lot of engagement from civil society, keeping an eye on things, and it was a tough process. There was a lot of pain and violence and difficult times, and we have to keep an eye out to make sure to make it sustainable.
2 minutes time, so let me wrap it up by just highlighting very quickly 3 points I think that we've tried to make in this session. One, fragility in middle-income countries is closely associated with pockets of fragility. We find this across all cities in the region. It affects particularly the urban poor. And two, it's critical to invest in better tools to measure, understand this phenomenon, understand its multiple manifestations and dynamics. And three, there is a portfolio of interventions, of programs and policies that can be mobilized to address this challenge. We at the bank and in our new strategy like to organize it around two important elements: strengthening community resilience to organized crime, in which things like what Santiago mentioned about how to prevent the recruitment of young people into these gangs, it's one of the key interventions that we have there. There are others dealing with local conflicts and so on. And the other one is about building institutional resilience, the resilience of the police, reforming the police, building the systems, its investigative capacities, its intelligence system, of the prosecutors, of the whole value chain in the criminal justice system: police, prosecutors, justice, and corrections, and a big emphasis on corrections, in which the IDB also has a big portfolio that is growing on how to reform corrections so that they are not the sort of recruitment place for organized crimes, but rather places of rehabilitation and reducing the recidivism of people that have committed a crime. So there are many things that can be done, and we look forward also to strengthen partnerships with the World Bank on this agenda. There are some initiatives already going on, but I think we've already exceeded the time. And wanted to thank our panelists and our keynote speaker, and thank you very much.